They didn't even ask his name. That was the first insult, sharp and invisible, slicing deeper than any weapon. Professor Henry Caldwell had been stopped before every black man in America had their stories, but this time, it felt different. Maybe because the sun was setting in that honey-gold way that made the city almost merciful, and still, mercy did not find him. Maybe because he was tired of pretending he didn't bleed. Maybe because the word boy hurled at him, spoken by a man half his age in uniform, cut through his years of dignity like a whip. Henry had taught philosophy at Boston University for 22 years. He'd lectured on Kant and Baldwin, on justice and the abyss, on the shape of human cruelty and the possibility of redemption. He'd filled classrooms with the sound of ideas colliding, had signed books for students who whispered thank you as if knowledge itself had been forbidden fruit. Yet here, on Tremont Street, all of that was ash. He was not a professor. He was not a father. He was not even a man. To these officers, he was only a shadow with skin too dark for their comfort. "Step out of the car," the taller officer said, his voice not requesting but announcing domination. Henry had done nothing more than signal late at a light. A trivial stop, if that. But the officer's eyes said something else, that this was sport, that this was about reminding him of his place. Henry's heart beat with the same heavy rhythm it always did in these encounters. Not fear of dying, though that was possible, but fear of being stripped down before the eyes of strangers who would see him only as spectacle. He stepped out, movements deliberate, academic even. He remembered once telling his students that existence precedes essence. Now, existence meant compliance. His essence was already rewritten by the gaze of men who saw threat in melanin. The shorter officer circled him like a hyena. "What's in the briefcase, Professor?" he sneered, spitting out the last word with bitter irony. Henry almost laughed. Inside the briefcase was a lecture draft on the ethics of recognition. The irony was cruel enough to deserve its own punchline. But Henry did not speak. Silence was its own armor, though it never stopped the blows. Around them, people gathered. Cell phones rose like fragile shields. Some whispered, some stared, but no one intervened. They never did. In America, witnesses often watched black pain as if it were a show tragic. Yes, but distant, consumable, never their responsibility. Henry's lips tightened. He thought of his wife, dead 3 winters ago from breast cancer, her laughter still echoing in the crevices of their old house. He thought of his son, David, who had risen from debate club president to the halls of Congress, a symbol of the dream that Henry once believed America could still honor. And he thought of the bitter truth, that even fathering a congressman did not shield you from being humiliated on a sidewalk for nothing more than existing. "Empty your pockets," barked the taller officer. Henry complied, laying out his wallet, keys, pen. The officer picked up the wallet, flicked it open, and read the ID. "Professor Henry Caldwell," he said, mockingly pronouncing it with theatrical care. "Professor, huh? You don't look like any professor I know." The laugh that followed was ugly, and the crowd's murmur deepened, shame mixing with fascination. Henry met his eyes then, steady, unblinking. For a moment, he saw the man hesitate, saw the fragility behind the badge. That was the thing about racists. They needed the performance of power because inside, they were terrified of the truth. That knowledge gave Henry no safety, but it gave him a kind of quiet, razor-thin dignity. Still, the humiliation pressed on. Words like boy, smart one, uppity slid out of their mouths like poison-tipped arrows. Each one sank deep, not because they were new, but because they were old, ancient, heavy with centuries of cruelty. Henry wanted to scream, to burn the street down with all the fury he had swallowed for decades. But professors learn restraint. Fathers learn restraint. Black men, most of all, are forced to learn restraint. And then before the next insult could land, the sound of hurried footsteps cut through the noise. The crowd shifted. Whispers rose like wind. A figure in a sharp navy suit, tie crisp, shoes shining with power not just worn but earned, emerged from the sea of onlookers. David Caldwell, Congressman Caldwell, son of Henry Caldwell, stepped into the golden light with the authority of a man who had carried entire communities on his shoulders. His voice was not loud when it came, but it was steel wrapped in velvet. "What exactly?" David asked, his gaze slicing through the officers. "Do you think you are doing to my father?" And the street, for one suspended heartbeat, was silent. The silence was so sharp it felt like glass breaking. For the first time, the officers faltered. The taller one blinked, eyes darting between Henry's calm, steady figure and the younger man now standing in front of them, exuding authority like a second skin. The shorter officer shifted his weight, his smirk evaporating as recognition dawned. Faces in the crowd lit up with murmurs. That's Congressman Caldwell. Phones tilted higher, capturing every flicker of expression, every tremor in the air. Henry stood very still. The golden light clung to his face like a crown and a curse. He did not move toward his son, did not retreat either. He had learned the hard way that in moments like this, even breathing too fast could be misconstrued as defiance. David's eyes, however, blazed. He wasn't just a congressman in this moment. He was a son watching his father as guide, his hero humiliated on an open street. He had grown up listening to Henry's voice, teaching him the difference between justice and revenge, between anger that consumes and anger that transforms. But right now, those lessons clashed violently with the raw fury swelling inside him. "Sir, we were just conducting a routine stop," the tall officer said at last, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure of so many eyes. His authority, so casual a minute ago, seemed suddenly fragile, like a mask slipping. David tilted his head, incredulous. "Routine? Do you routinely pull a respected professor out of his car, search him without cause, and insult him in public like a criminal?" He didn't raise his voice, but every syllable carried weight, grinding into the pavement like iron. The shorter officer tried to recover, waving a hand dismissively. "We didn't know who he was." The crowd hissed collectively. Henry closed his eyes for a beat, the irony burning. That was the point, wasn't it? That without credentials, without titles, without the thin armor of recognition, his black skin was verdict enough. David's gaze hardened. "You didn't know who he was? That's your defense." He took a step closer, his presence towering even without physical size. "So if he were any other black man, he'd deserve this treatment? If he wasn't my father, would you still be calling him boy on a public street?" The taller officer's mouth opened and closed, but words failed him. The shorter one flushed, jaw tightening in defiance, but the cameras were everywhere now. They knew every second was evidence. Every syllable could end careers. Henry finally spoke then, his voice soft but carrying more power than any uniform. "David." Just his name. A plea wrapped in warning. He didn't want his son destroyed by the same fire that had burned him. But David shook his head slowly, his jaw clenched. "No, Dad. Not this time." Something shifted in the crowd. What had been passive observation now crackled into solidarity. Strangers began nodding, whispering agreements, some even speaking aloud. "He's right. That's not justice. They can't get away with this." For once, silence was not complicity, it was breaking. The taller officer straightened his back, trying to reclaim authority. "Congressman Caldwell, you will address him as Professor Caldwell." David cut in, his voice sharp as glass. "You will address him with the respect he deserves, the respect you denied him until I arrived." He let the words hang, then added, lower, colder, "And you will explain yourself before this community, before these witnesses, and before the law." The air trembled. Henry's hands tightened at his sides, torn between pride and sorrow. Pride that his son stood like a fortress, sorrow that it had come to this, that even after all their striving, the battlefield was still the same sidewalk where dignity was stripped away. The shorter officer muttered something under his breath, but the crowd caught it, overreacting. Phones zoomed in instantly, recording his sneer. The audience gasped. And in that moment, the officers lost not just control of the scene, but the narrative itself. They were no longer protectors. They were aggressors caught in the act. David turned to the bystanders, his voice suddenly lifting, resonant. "This is why we march. This is why we fight. Because a man who has given his life to teaching, who has raised children to believe in this country, still cannot drive home without being reduced to nothing by the color of his skin." His chest rose and fell, fury channeled into something greater than rage. "If this can happen to my father, imagine what happens in silence to the men and women without cameras, without a congressman walking up at the right moment." Applause erupted. Not the kind of applause for entertainment, but raw, desperate, affirming claps that broke the chains of silence. Henry felt tears press against his eyes, unbidden. He had taught ethics his whole life, and here was his son turning pain into testimony, wound into weapon. The officers shifted uneasily, shrinking under the gaze of 100 phones. The taller one stammered out an apology, hollow and bureaucratic. "Professor Caldwell, we regret the misunderstanding." Henry met his gaze and, for the first time, spoke not with silence, but with centuries behind his voice. "A misunderstanding is when you forget an appointment. This was not a misunderstanding. This was humiliation." The crowd roared, voices rising like waves. The officers' faces paled. They had lost their grip on the narrative, and worse, they had exposed the very thing they'd tried to bury. David stepped closer to his father then, laying a hand gently on his shoulder. The golden sunlight flared between them, catching in the lenses of dozens of cameras. Father and son, professor and congressman, victim and witness, standing united. "Let's go home, Dad," David murmured. But Henry shook his head slowly, surprising even himself. His voice was steady. "Not yet." The crowd quieted, leaning into his words. He turned, not to the officers, but to the people watching. His voice carried with a clarity honed over years of lectures, sermons of philosophy now transformed into survival. For every one of us humiliated, for every life diminished by hatred, we must stand together. Dignity is not granted by badges or offices. It is born with us. It cannot be stripped unless we surrender it. There was no applause this time, just silence. A heavy, reverent silence, like the moment after a hymn when the echoes still linger in the rafters. David looked at him with awe, the anger in his chest softening into something deeper, reverence. He had come ready to defend, but his father had already transcended. The officers muttered something about leaving, retreating quickly into their cruiser, engines growling like cornered animals. They were gone within seconds, but the wound remained carved into the street. Henry exhaled, long and weary. He turned to his son, saw the young man's fists still clenched, his shoulders rigid. He reached out, placed a hand on David's chest, over the hammering heart. "Justice isn't vengeance, son. Remember that." David swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I know, Dad, but it feels like sometimes justice is too slow." Henry's smile was small, tired, but luminous in the fading gold. "That's why we keep walking, even when they try to stop us." The crowd began to disperse, but slowly, reverently. Some approached Henry, shaking his hand, whispering thanks. Others nodded at David with newfound respect, not just for his office, but for the bloodline that had shaped him. Cameras clicked, posts uploaded, a digital tide carrying the story into homes far beyond Tremont Street. But for Henry, the night was no victory. It was another reminder carved into his bones. And for David, it was a spark, the kind that could ignite a movement if he let it. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of amber fire, father and son walked together, the briefcase swinging lightly at Henry's side. Inside it, the lecture on the ethics of recognition waited. But Henry realized, with a sharp twist of irony, that the true lecture had been given today not in a classroom, but on a street where recognition had been denied and then reclaimed, not by argument, but by standing unbroken in the face of cruelty. They walked on, into the deepening night, carrying both the scars and the promise of a brighter dawn. The city at night had its own pulse, and Henry felt it as he and David walked together, step for step, down streets where shadows pooled thick in the corners. Neon lights blinked above storefronts, voices echoed from bars, but all Henry could hear was the faint, stubborn throb of humiliation still pounding beneath his ribs. He had faced worse in his youth, spit hurled at him when he tried to integrate a library, fists waiting outside school dances, but age had not dulled the sting of being reduced to less than human. David, on the other hand, was aflame. His stride was quick, sharp, almost militant. Every few seconds, he opened his mouth as if to speak, then shut it again, his anger simmering too hot for words. Finally, he muttered, "They'll see those videos. They'll have to answer for it." Henry sighed, adjusting the strap of his briefcase. Answering isn't the same as changing. "They can't hide anymore," David pressed, his voice low but seething. "This is different, Dad. People saw. They saw it happen to you. It's not some anonymous man whose name gets lost in a headline. You're respected. They can't dismiss this." Henry stopped walking, turned to his son beneath the amber glow of a streetlight. His face was calm, his voice steady. And what about the ones who don't have a title, David? The ones who aren't professors or congressmen's fathers? Do they deserve less? The question cut David like a blade. His lips parted, but no answer came. Because he knew the truth. If not for the cameras, if not for his intervention, his father's pain would have vanished into the statistics. Another story whispered, but never heard. Henry resumed walking, slower this time. Power notices power, son. That's why they backpedaled the moment you stepped in. Not because they suddenly saw my humanity, but because they saw yours. Because you carry the weight of office. That's not justice. That's survival. David clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms. Then maybe it's time survival isn't enough. Maybe it's time we stop waiting for them to give us justice and start forcing them to face it. Henry glanced at him, an almost imperceptible smile tugging at the edge of his lips. Now you sound like Baldwin. They reached Henry's townhouse, a brick building worn at the edges but dignified, like its owner. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old books and cedar. David sank into the worn leather armchair, still fuming, while Henry placed his briefcase on the coffee table and poured himself a glass of water. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Henry spoke. Do you know what hurt me the most tonight? David looked up, startled. What? That I wasn't surprised. Henry's voice was quiet, almost fragile. Not for a moment. Every insult, every order, every look it was all familiar. Like hearing an old song you hate, but know every lyric to. That's what broke me, David. That it was all so ordinary. The words hit David harder than any insult the officers had hurled. Ordinary. A father's humiliation so common it felt rehearsed. He rubbed his temples, anger giving way to despair. Then we have to make it extraordinary. We have to make sure the world doesn't look away this time. Henry studied his son, his eyes softening with pride and sorrow intertwined. You've always carried more fire than me. I tried to teach you patience, reason. But maybe the world needs your fire now. David leaned forward, his voice trembling but resolute. Dad, I'm going to take this to Congress. Not just a press statement, not just outrage for a news cycle. I'll call hearings. I'll drag police chiefs in front of cameras. I'll make them answer, not just for what they did to you, but for what they do every day to people without a voice. Henry exhaled slowly, his chest tight with conflicting emotions. Pride swelled, but so did fear. He knew the cost of challenging systems built on centuries of denial. Be careful, David. Fire can warm, but it can also burn you alive. David's jaw set. Then let it burn me, if it lights the way for others. For the first time that evening, Henry smiled fully. It was a weary smile, but it held light. He thought of his late wife, how she used to say their son was born with thunder in his lungs. Maybe she had been right. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The video of Henry's humiliation spread like wildfire. News anchors dissected every frame. Activists marched with his name on their lips, and social media burned with outrage. Some voices tried to dismiss it, isolated incident, misunderstanding, but the images of a respected professor called boy by uniformed men were impossible to erase. Henry became, unwillingly, a symbol. Students held vigils outside the university. Colleagues filled his inbox with messages of support and horror. His face appeared on magazine covers, his name invoked in debates. Yet every time he saw the footage replay, the humiliation rose fresh in his chest, raw and unhealed. David, meanwhile, took the fight to the Capitol. In speeches that thundered across chambers, he demanded accountability. He introduced legislation for federal oversight, body cameras, racial bias training. His words cut deep, not because they were angry, but because they carried the weight of a son's grief turned into resolve. Opponents pushed back, of course. Some sneered that he was exploiting a personal incident for political gain. Others questioned whether reform was even necessary. But David stood unflinching, armed with both evidence and moral fire. One night, after a long session, David called his father. His voice was tired, frayed at the edges. Dad, sometimes I feel like I'm shouting into a void. Like no matter what I say, they've already decided not to hear me. Henry listened quietly, then answered with the calm wisdom of decades. Voids have echoes, son. Even if they pretend not to hear, the sound remains. Don't underestimate how far your voice can travel. David closed his eyes, tears threatening. I just don't want your pain to be wasted. Henry's reply was soft, steady. Pain only wastes when it silences us. And you've already turned it into a storm. But storms invite resistance. Weeks later, Henry's townhouse was vandalized, slurs painted in red across his door, windows smashed. He found it at dawn, the golden sun spilling across hate, made visible. For a long moment, he stood frozen, staring at the words that had chased him his whole life, now bleeding on his own home. David rushed over when he heard, fury threatening to explode. This is terrorism, he spat. They're trying to scare you into silence. Henry traced one word with his finger, not in defeat, but in quiet defiance. I've seen these words before. On bathroom stalls. On locker doors. On flyers slipped under my office door. They think paint can break me. He turned to his son, eyes steady. No. All they've done is remind me why your fight matters. That night, father and son stood on the townhouse steps before a crowd of supporters, lights from news cameras flooding the scene. Henry spoke first, his voice strong despite the tremor in his hands. You can break glass. You can throw paint. But you cannot break the human spirit. You cannot erase dignity. And you cannot silence truth. Then David stepped up, fire in his eyes. They tried to humiliate my father. They tried to vandalize his home. But what they've done is awaken a movement that will not stop until every person, no matter their skin, no matter their name, can walk these streets without fear. The crowd erupted, chants rising like thunder. And in that moment, beneath the glare of lights and the weight of history pressing down, Henry felt something shift. His humiliation had become not just his burden, but a spark igniting countless others. The night ended with father and son embracing on those steps, the golden glow of street lamps casting them in light that felt almost holy. And Henry realized that while the officers had tried to strip him of his humanity, what they had truly done was expose the unbreakable bond between generations, between those who endured and those who refused to accept endurance as enough. The fight was only beginning. But for the first time in a long while, Henry believed it might not end in silence. The weeks turned into months, and what began on that sunlit street outside Tremont had grown into a nationwide conversation. Newspapers called it the Caldwell moment. Some described it as a spark of a new civil rights wave, others as a temporary outrage. Henry watched it all unfold with the strange dislocation of someone who had been forced into the center of history without asking to stand there. David, meanwhile, became the voice of that history. His speeches echoed across the House floor, his words replayed on networks and social media feeds, his face splashed across late-night shows. He was no longer just Congressman Caldwell. He was the son who had refused to stay silent, who had taken his father's humiliation and turned it into a national demand for change. But with visibility came danger. Threatening letters arrived daily at his office. Voicemails dripped with venom. Protesters gathered outside his townhouse, waving flags twisted into symbols of defiance against progress. And through it all, David carried himself with the same steel resolve, though his father could see the toll in the weariness of his eyes. One late evening, after another long session on the Hill, David returned to his father's townhouse. He slumped into the armchair like a soldier returning from the front. Henry poured him a glass of whiskey and sat across from him. For a while, neither spoke. The silence was heavy but familiar, a father and son sharing the weight of a battle that spanned generations. Finally, Henry broke it. They're trying to break you. That's their game. If they can't silence you with fear, they'll exhaust you until you collapse. David rubbed his temples. Some days I wonder if they're winning. Every step forward feels like dragging a mountain. Henry leaned forward, his eyes sharp despite the years. You're not dragging it. You're moving it. Inch by inch. Don't you see? That's what change has always been. Never sudden, never easy. Always inch by inch. David looked at his father then, really looked. He saw the man who had endured decades of slights and scars, the man who had raised him on lessons of dignity, the man who still believed in hope even when it was bruised. And something inside him steadied. The next morning, David called a press conference. Cameras crowded the steps of the Capitol, reporters shouting questions. He stood at the podium, tall and unflinching, and delivered a speech that would later be replayed in classrooms and documentaries. My father was humiliated because of his skin. He was stripped of dignity on a street where anyone could have been him. This is not an isolated incident. This is America refusing to see itself in the mirror. But we will no longer look away. We demand accountability. We demand reform. We demand a nation where dignity is not conditional on race, wealth, or power. And let me be clear, this fight is not just political, it is personal. Because until every father can walk free without fear, none of us are free. The crowd erupted. Some wept openly. Others raised fists. Even critics, hardened by years of partisan battles, admitted privately that his words had cut to the bone. Legislation followed. It was contested, watered down, delayed, but progress seeped through the cracks. Federal oversight committees were formed. Grants for bias training and body cameras were passed. It was not revolution, not yet, but it was a beginning. Henry watched it all from the sidelines, both proud and wary. He knew history's pattern too well. Progress always met resistance. And resistance always came with cost. That cost came one autumn evening. After delivering a fiery town hall speech, David was leaving through a side door when a man lunged at him, shouting slurs. Security tackled the attacker, but not before a knife grazed David's side. The wound was shallow, but the message was deep. Hate had bared its teeth. When Henry arrived at the hospital, his heart nearly gave way at the sight of his son on the bed, pale but alive. He grasped David's hand, his own shaking. "You could have died," he whispered, voice breaking. David managed a weak smile. "But I didn't. And I won't stop, Dad. Not now. Not ever." Tears spilled down Henry's cheeks. He hadn't cried since his wife's funeral. But here they came, unstoppable, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that his son was carrying a fight bigger than either of them. He bent close, his voice low but firm. "Then promise me one thing, David. Promise me you'll fight not just with fire, but with wisdom. Don't let hate turn you into the thing you're fighting against." David squeezed his father's hand, eyes wet. "I promise." Winter came, and with it, a strange calm. The legislation passed. The attacker was sentenced. The protests that had once filled streets now slowed, though their echoes remained. Henry returned to teaching, his students watching him with new reverence, as if he carried not just knowledge but living history. One day, as snow fell outside the lecture hall, Henry stood before his class and spoke words that would be quoted for years. "The measure of a society is not how it treats the powerful, but how it treats those it tries to make powerless. Justice is not a gift we wait to be given. It is a truth we must live, even when the world refuses to see it." The students rose in applause, some with tears, and Henry felt, for the first time since that golden evening on Tremont Street, that his humiliation had been transformed into something greater than pain. David visited often, their bond now unshakable. They walked together through snow-dusted streets, through parks where children played, through neighborhoods where murals had sprung up depicting fathers and sons, dignity and defiance. Everywhere they went, people stopped them, some to thank, some to share their own stories of humiliation and resilience. And Henry realized something profound. His suffering had become a mirror in which others saw themselves, and his son's fire had become a torch lighting the way forward. One spring evening, as the sun set once more in golden fire, Henry and David sat on the townhouse steps, watching the light fade. Henry spoke softly. "Do you remember that night, when you walked up in your suit and asked those officers what they thought they were doing?" David chuckled, shaking his head. "I remember thinking I might explode." Henry smiled faintly. "That was the moment, son. The moment the balance shifted. They thought they were humiliating me, but what they really did was awaken you. And through you, they awakened a nation." David turned to him, eyes shining. "No, Dad. You awakened me long before that. Every lesson you taught, every story you shared was already in me. That night just lit the fuse." The two men sat in silence then, the golden light wrapping them like a benediction. For Henry, it was the end of one story and the beginning of another. For David, it was the confirmation that his father's dignity had not been stripped but magnified. And for the world watching, it was proof that even in the face of humiliation, the human spirit could rise not alone, but together, across generations. The fight was far from over. But on that evening, as father and son sat side by side in the glow of a forgiving sun, it felt for a breath, for a heartbeat as if justice had finally exhaled. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.